И спасибо большое за это возможность здесь выступить. Я буду говорить по-английски, и у меня цитаты по-русски, и if I speak too, I will try to speak slowly, but if I speak too quickly, please somebody say slow down, because if I speak quickly and you don't understand me, this will be a torture, and it should be somewhat interesting. I would hope. Okay? So today I would like to offer you some ideas on what the phrase Toska po rodine meant to Russians in the 18th and early 19th centuries, and what this had to do with their ideas of being Russian at that time. As you know, Toska po rodine signifies longing for the homeland, homesickness, nostalgia, or in French, mal du pays. Perhaps it is not surprising, given this well-established phrase, that the theoretically distinct concepts of Toska and rodina are often linked in the Russian language. As I hope to show you today, there are a number of reasons for this, a number of factors in Russian culture that encourage us to associate Toska with rodina. In the first half of my talk, I will review the evolution of the term Toska in Russian literature of the 18th and early 19th centuries. I will then turn to the history of the term rodina and the term compound term Toska po rodine to argue that the sentiment Toska po rodine, or longing for the homeland, is intrinsically related to a Russian sense of self, and also that this Russian sense of self has close relatives in Switzerland. So first of all, Toska. What is Toska? Where do we find it? And what, if anything, does it have to do with Russianness? Well, in recent years, a number of scholars have gone so far as to argue that Toska, or Toskovania, is key to the experience of being Russian. Mikhail Evstifeeva, for example, the theorist of postmodernism, sees Toska as breaking all class barriers. It levels the distinctions between the elite and the peasantry. Toska, he says, is Russian. It's not Spanish or Egyptian or Chinese, but Russian because it results from the peculiar characteristics of Russian geographical space. Namely, it's the result of the бесконечная долгота пространства, ничем не прерываемого, бескачественного, плоского, равнинно-однообразного. One of Epstein's examples is from Yevgeny Onegin, who is gripped by Toska precisely when he leaves Petersburg and travels into the Russian countryside, and the same was true for his creator, Alexander Pushkin. Toska is a peculiarly Russian type of despair in Epstein's view, and it occurs when the emptiness and poverty of the surrounding landscape influences the state of the Russian soul. The state of the soul, he writes here, Toska это тощий пейзаж, как состояние души. He's obviously talking about the Russian soul. A more distanced and less romantic view of Toska belongs to Sheila Fitzpatrick, the historian of Soviet Russia, who was surprised when she found that the sentiment plays such a central role in Soviet Russia. It's part of a central role in what she calls the emotional repertoire of Stalinist society. Indeed, Fitzpatrick notes, Toska is one of the emotions that is most frequently performed in the 1930s and 1940s, and it turns out to be almost omnipresent. She defines Toska, as you can see on the slide, as a particular kind of yearning sadness. She says that it's a non-event related, which is vague, sort of without specific causes, a non-event related melancholy and yearning, close to the German Weltschmerz, but perhaps a little less exalted. And this is a pretty good definition of what Toska means today. It generally refers to an abstract sense of malaise that has no immediate cause, often no immediate object, and for which there's no clear solution. It's an emotion that we can roughly equate with English words such as anguish or longing or yearning, and we often don't know for what. But this was not the case in the 18th century. In fact, understandings of Toska have evolved quite a bit over the last 200 or 300 years. And in the 18th century, conventions for expressing Toska or for performing it in literary texts were somewhat different. Today, Toska may be non-event related, but in 18th century texts, it generally was event related, and frequently provoked by the loss of a specific person or place. So what I'd like to do now is review its evolution in literary texts. While Toska forms part of the Slavonic linguistic patrimony and is attested in Old Russian, it was not commonplace in the literature of Peter the Great's era. It was not a favorite, for example, of Feofan Prokopovich, who wrote a Slovo na pogrebienie Petra Velikova, in which he speaks о пригорком семлещения, о сердечной горести, о печали и о жалости, but he does not mention Toska. Similarly, in his Slovo na pochvalu pamяти Petra Velikova, from that same year, Prokopovich writes, «Плачемся и рыдаем, скорбим и сетуем, тужим от горести сердца», but there is no explicit Toskovania. Nor was Toska a predilection of Antioch Cantemir, who preferred other terms for grief and sadness. Here is a list of Cantemir's favorite terms in the order of the frequency with which they occur in his Sobranie stихотворения. He uses the word pichal 68 times, to žить 35, the root slioz or sliez 30 times, the root plach or plach 28 times, skorp 15, tamit occurs 10 times, and so on. But we do not find Toska. Indeed, if we ignore references to Toskana, the only appearance of the root tosk in Cantemir Sobranie stихотворения occurs here. This is a piece of a poem, a facetious poem, in which he uses the verb toskovать. It's a poem from 1740, stихам своим, written to his own poetry. This is during a period when he has writer's block and is having difficulty writing, and so he writes, «Скучен вам стихи мои, ящик». If we change the order around, it's a little bit easier to read. «Ящик, где вы целых 10 лет тоскуете в тени за ключами». So here we've got Toska, which is both ironic and it's also quite physical. These are two properties that we don't associate with Toska today. Toskovania is what the poems are suffering, the poems that are languishing in the closed drawer. It results from their sense of physical imprisonment. These are features that reflect the etymological origins of Toska. Here's a review of what the etymological dictionaries say about Toska's beginnings. As we can see in Old Russian, Toska was related to conceptions of теснение, or closeness, restricted space, confinement. Certainly this is a very different picture than the wide open spaces that Epstein was talking about as the sources of some peculiarly Russian sentiment. Nor do we find in Cantemir that Toska is abstract or vague as it is today. The poems want to get out of the drawer, they want to be read, they want to be reshaped, they want to participate actively in the poet's creative life. So where does this idea of Toska as an elevated and serious literary sentiment come from? The earliest literary reference to Toska of this type that I've been able to find is probably that we can find in the work of Cantemir's contemporary Vasily Treliakovsky, who was known for his translation and adaptation of foreign literary models that contain bold new emotions such as love. Toska seems to be a sentiment that Treliakovsky referred to only rarely. Treliakovsky it's a little hard to tell because I look for these words by doing electronic searches of texts, and Treliakovsky's work is famously so boring and long-winded that people don't put the entire volumes online. they're abridged for his collected works, and so I don't really know what is in them.
Even computers get bored.
Even computers get bored. Well, they might be online somewhere, but not in a searchable format. But I haven't so far been able to find them. But I don't think I really don't think his Sobranie Sочинения has all of his, what is it, Pisma k любви or whatever, the Journey to the Ile d'Amour or whatever it's called. Anyway, he seems to have, it seems to be a sentiment that Trediakovsky referred to only rarely, but he does so with the seriousness and force that we find in later writers at the end of the 18th century. He also links it to love. He links it to love, but he also links it, it's a new emotion like love is for him, and he links it to the traditions of European and classical literature. Here's an example from Trediakovsky. These are two poems. Toska, they're both from 1730. Toska appears in the title of each poem, but not in the poems themselves, obviously, which are written entirely in French, as you can see. There is no word in French that would be a translation of Toska. Instead, what we have here are two descriptions of scenes that describe, that illustrate the Toska that is cited in the title. First, Toska is described from her point of view, and then it's presented from his point of view, these two lovers. The name Phyllis in the last line indicates that the scene being described is a goodbye, the tragic goodbye of Phyllis and Demophon. This is a classical subject taken from the work of Ovid, and it was a favorite. We find it in a lot of classical literature from the 18th century. If you go and do searches for the word Toska, you will find more than one example of Phyllis and Demophon, and you will also find a lot of goodbyes between Dido and Aeneas. Those seem to be the topos, the classical literary topos of adieu seems to be a context in which people felt that it was appropriate to refer to Toska. Trediakovsky also initiated an enduring connection between Toska and the elegy, the genre of the elegy, in his stylistic guidelines for the composition of Russian verse, where he explains what an elegy is and provides an example of elegiac hexameter that includes the word Toska. This is a first-person lament by an idyllic Arcadian personage who is suffering from nesnosная toska when he learns of his beloved's death. In this poem, which I don't have on a slide, by Trediakovsky, Toska is a pleonastic term. It is the fifth lexeme in a row of overlapping emotions. We have beznadezhdia, matiesh, gorest, pichali, and then finally Toska. Lomonosov took Toska still more seriously, and in the 1750s he raised it to the status of a literary concept that was thoroughly impermeated with the classical spirit. We see a debt to Trediakovsky and Lomonosov's taste for dramatic and classical goodbyes, as in his translation of Virgil in The Brief Guide to Eloquence. It also appears in his verse tragedies and in his unfinished epic Pyotr Veliki, where it describes the collective sentiments of the Russian people who had lived before Peter в отчаянии, в тоске, в стенании без сна. Sumarokov, our next writer in the historical progression, used the word Toska more than Lomonosov did, often in verse tragedy. Indeed, in the genres of tragedy and epic by the 1750s, we find Toska constantly, and it continues in those two genres in the work of Maykov, Hiraskov, Knyazhnin, Krylov, and Kapnist. Basically, if you want to write genre or epic, you better put Toska in it. It proves to your reader that you are a serious writer. Literary Toska also appears in Sumarokov's lyric poetry. This is often based on lighter classical genres such as the eclogue, the idyll, or the song. In these verses, Toska is a more personal sentiment. It's appropriate to the register of the poet's own voice, or the voice of other personages that sometimes narrate these verses. Sometimes Sumarokov writes from the point of view of a peasant girl, for example, a shepherdess. The poet generally taskuyet because a love interest is absent, dead, or simply indifferent and refuses to reciprocate his feelings, or because cruel society has alienated and ostracized him. Sometimes Sumarokov's Toska is even stripped of its object or its cause, and thus, while Toska tears the poet or wrenches him, we're not exactly sure why. I'll give you an example of the way that this sometimes works. This is Sumarokov's sonnet Na Chayanya from 1768. Here Toska has no reason really for being. It seems to be existential, but it tears the body apart in scenes of what are basically emotional carnage. Жестокая тоска, отчаяние дочь, терзай меня, тоска, и рви мои ты члены, and so on. In the 1760s, Sumarokov's junior colleague, Denis van Wiesen, displays a very strong interest in French-inspired literary Toska. Van Wiesen later became famous for his criticisms of the French and of Russian Francophilia, but in the 1760s, Van Wiesen was happily delighted in French writing. He wrote a comedy Corion in 1764, for example, which is the reworking of a French text in which the word Toska appears 18 times. The male protagonist at the end of the fourth act declares «Терзаюсь, мучусь, рвусь лучейшею тоскою». In Yosif from 1769, or Yosif 1769, which is the translation of a French poem in prose by the writer Paul Bitaoubet, we can see clearly that Van Wiesen is extremely attracted to the notion of Toska. He uses this word 14 times, and it's interesting that if you check his translation with the French original, he uses Toska in Russian to translate these words in French. Sombre rêverie, mélancolie, douleur, morne tristesse, regrette, être andouille, and alarme. That's all Toska for him. So he really does like the word quite a bit. And he felt that it was an important literary ingredient. So in sentimentalism, Toska is among one of the most highly prized of the sentimentalist sentiments. It was also very important for women writers. This picture here is a frontispiece from a publication from 1796 called Otrivki, written by Alexandra Khvostova. It contains, this book Otrivki contains 2 short sketches, both of which are elaborations on the theme of Toska. In this vague but very, very emotional text, Khvostova was quite successful. The first sketch had been published a year before in a journal, and it was prefaced by praise from the editor, who speaks of the book, praises the book for its дух осиянской горести, нежность и глубокость меланхолических чувств. What is remarkable about Khvostova's text, and actually it's trying to translate this text that got me started working on Toska in the first place, because if you write in a translation the word Toska as many times as she does in Russian, it's almost unreadable. I mean, you can't really stand that much Toska. Now that the era of sentimentalism is over, it's a lot. I mean, if you're translating it, you have to translate it, but then you have to explain in the preface why you did it, because it becomes hard to read. Anyway, it's the sheer density of Khvostova's use of this term. So I did a count, and it turns out that in Khvostova's text Otrivki, the word Toska, or other words built on the root Toska, Tosklili, Toskavanya, и так далее, comprise 1 word out of every 310 words. So then we turn to Toskavanya in Karamzin. Karamzin has very few works in which the word Toska appears more than once. It usually appears in poems. The poems are not particularly long. It would be strange. You don't need that much Toska. Just once is enough. You know, Karamzin has a light touch after all. But the word becomes increasingly infrequent in his work after the 1790s. And the densest occurrence of Toska in Karamzin is in his stylized historical tale, Natalia Boyarskaya Dочь, from 1792. I just said that in Kostova you find Toska is one word in every 310. In Karamzin, the densest that his Toska ever gets is in Natalia Boyarskaya Dочь, and that's one word in 1,345 words. So that's a little bit different. It's not nearly as Tosklivi a text as Kostova's. Moreover, Toska in Natalia Boyarskaya Dочь is no longer a lofty classical sentiment, but it's already laced with irony and humor. He's already making fun of Toska in 1795, in 1792, in other words, gentle fun. Karamzin, in fact, was more interested in melancholia, as I've argued elsewhere, and he took firm steps in the 1790s to establish this as a new emotion among the ranks of Russian literary sentiments. Toska had a little interest for Karamzin, in part because it was overused by Van Wiesen before he was even born, and Karamzin spends a lot of time trying to distance himself from previous generations. He wants to be something new. He doesn't want to write like Van Wiesen does. It also seems to have acquired the odor of pisательницы by the 1790s, and Karamzin, who required new terms and concepts, as well as distance from the literary practice of women, wanted to remain on the stylistic forefront of Russian letters, and he could not use Toska and do so. So roughly then, from the 1790s onward, Toska no longer has a fundamental role in the emotional repertoire of the nobleman writer. After a brief flirtation with melancholia, male writers gave up that as well, and when the sentimentalist era and the era of the sentimentalist epigons concludes in about 1820, Toska made fewer and fewer appearances in the literary language. It seems to have regained some popularity towards the end of the 19th century and again in the Stalinist era, as Fitzpatrick points out. But the high-styled classical Toska that we find in lyric verse or tragic drama in the mid-18th century remains a feature specific to that era. But before I discuss Rodina, I'm almost finished with Toska, but before I discuss Rodina, let me return for a minute to the idea of physical Toska. It was common in literary texts, as you've already heard in a couple of examples, to speak of Toska, and more prestigious classical literary Toska, as tearing or ripping or lacerating the person who felt it. You know, this terзай меня Toska and so on. But beyond using metaphors of physical damage and pain to dramatize Toska, there's another Toska which actually refers to bodily suffering. This Toska is less obvious in literary text, probably because it's simply a less literary concept, but it does appear, for example, in the travel letters and diaries of Denis Van Wiesen, who often wrote about his health concerns. Am I speaking? Okay? You follow us? Okay. Let me show you a couple of examples. The first is a letter from Van Wiesen from 1777 or 78. I've got a little conflict here in the date. This is when Van Wiesen and his ailing wife traveled to Montpellier because she has worms and needs to be cured. And this is what he writes: «Как скоро выживем Кристу, так отсюда поеду. Через несколько дней доктор намеревается дать ей известное лекарство в полной мере. Он столь долго мешкал для того, что, как лекарство безмерно тяжело и крепко, то надлежит укрепить ее силы и к претерпению всей тоски и мучения, с которым червь выходит. Another example, so we're talking here about something completely different, no? Another example appears in Van Biesen's diary from, diary not a letter, but his diaries from 10 years later when he himself was ill. He had become semi-paralyzed and he was visiting doctors in the Baltic. And among the various treatments that they administered to him was a medicine that was supposed to make him vomit. Поутру, пишет, был у меня доктор Герц и нашел за нужное, чтобы я вечером принял рвотное. В 6 часов принял я рвотное и страдал до полуночи. Тоска была смертельная. What exactly is the physical sensation that he's describing here as toska? Is it nausea? That would recall the unpleasant sense of constriction that seems to be associated with Toska's etymological origins, and that we also saw in Cantemir's poem about the poems, his poems lying in the drawer. Certainly, Van Biesen's Toska is not provoked by the wide and empty spaces of Russia, as Epstein would have it. Indeed, it's brought on by travel abroad, and specifically by the experience of undergoing medical therapies in foreign spas, and by introducing harsh medicines into an already overtaxed and exhausted body. Nonetheless, this link between Toska and physical illness, it seems to me, has largely been forgotten in contemporary Russian, and like Epstein, we now think of Toska as a more abstract state of emotional anguish. The physical Toska is also important, it seems to me, because it suggests that the Toska, when we have a phrase like Toska по родине, we're not just talking about Toska as some vague kind of angst or anguish or longing for an absent homeland, but actual physical illness. In other words, the Toska in Toska по родине is equivalent to the ve in Heimweh or to the maladie or mal in mal du pays. In fact, Toska по родине would seem to be a Russian calque or translation of these terms from the era that I'm talking about. Another synonym, of course, is nostalgia or nostalgia, which, as you may know, in this era did refer to physical illness. Since the 18th century, or since the 19th century actually, nostalgia has been de-pathologized, and it has become, like Toska, an undefined feeling that generally has no specific object. But when the term was coined in 1688 by a medical student in Basel named Johannes Hofer, it was explicitly intended to make, as a way to make a specific and well-known condition. There was already a condition of nostalgia. People already felt this sentiment. And it was known by different words. It was known as Heimweh, or it was known, Hofer says, as maladie du pays. But he wants to become a scientifically defined illness, so he invents a new Greek-based word for it, which is the word nostalgia. So this word comes from, not from ancient Greece, but from 1688, Switzerland. Okay, I'll return to Hofer shortly. Now I'd like to talk a little bit more about the word rodina. So in the middle of the 20th century, the term rodina is one of the rhetorical concepts that Stalin favored in his official speeches, and we tend to associate it, like the word Toska, with a highly emotional linguistic register, such as that found in heart-rending songs. But in the 18th century, rodina generally had a more restricted and local meaning. It referred specifically to the place where one was born, or родился. Rodina, rod, родился, да? Which is to say where one's родители lived, or on a slightly larger scale where one's rod, or extended family, lived. Rodina may be translated into English as homeland, or native land, or motherland, but it is not fatherland, which in Russia is rendered by Отечество, and is more specifically related to the state, rather than to one's personal or familial identity. Rodina also eventually came to mean country or political state, of course, but it began as a geographically more modest term signifying one's family home or native region, much like the French term pays. Moreover, the term rodina in the 18th and early 19th century in Russia had a very strong class connotation. It was generally associated with the homeland of the peasant. When elite Russians wanted to speak about their own homeland, they preferred to use the term Отечество. And since patriotism was a very popular topic in literary texts from the 18th century, Отечество and Любовь к Отечеству, which can be translated as patriotism, were terms widely found. Let's look at an example. This is perhaps the earliest use that I have found, or literary occurrence, of the whole phrase Toska po rodine. It's the title of a verse song. This is not all of it, but a fragment of a verse here from a writer named Pavel Gagarin from 1795. This is the lament of a soldier who's stationed on the Niemen River, far away from his dear Rodina and from his beloved girlfriend. But the homesickness that we find in this poem is not Gagarin's own. Gagarin was in the military, but he was a highly placed officer and not the common soldier whose voice and perspective he assumes here. It's the pose of the peasant soldier that allows him to speak of his Rodina. К милой родине послал, пойдешь, слеза родная, ты на родину ко мне. He can only say that because he's pretending to be a peasant. So when do elite Russians begin to use the term Rodina to talk about their own experiences? I should probably point out that the corpus that I'm using is necessarily quite elitist, because literature in this period was written almost exclusively by the elite, so that the texts I'm examining don't tell us very much about what Toska might have meant to other social classes. Nor do they tell us what Toska might have meant to members of the nobility when they're not explicitly expressing this in written form. So it's a, like I say, it's a literary Toska, is what we're talking about here. Elite texts show us, though, that by the end of the Napoleonic period, it had become widely possible for members of the nobility to use Rodina to refer to their own experiences, and not just those of the peasants. For various reasons, the French invasion led to a dramatic rapprochement between the noble and peasant classes in Russia, and it was in this period that the Russian elite formed new emotional links both with their native territory and with the Russian people. During and after 1812, the elite began to use Rodina to refer both to their own personal homes and native regions, as well as to the greater homeland of Russia. And in the decades that followed the wars, we can find texts in which elite writers perform both love and Toska, both for their Отечество and for their Rodina. We might also note that there's a slight difference between these terms, even when Rodina expands to something that belongs to the nobleman and something that can be as large as the Отечество. When the writer's sentiments are felt to be deeper and more essential or intrinsic to his identity, they're more likely to be directed towards the Rodina rather than to the Отечество. Another important point that I would like to make is that the nature of the Napoleonic conflict in Russia, by which I mean especially the brutal defensive war of 1812, meant that when elite Russians came to embrace the term Rodina in this very period, the concept was already imbued with Toska. So that the experience of loss is essential to the term's emotional coloring. And the word is enthusiastically adopted, it seems to me, by the Napoleonic era's nobility, exactly because it carries the trace of their freshly painful experience. It's as if the concept of rodina was identified by the elite as a potentially interesting concept, claimed by them as personally relevant, lost, and romanticized all at the same time. Indeed, I think that the phrase "Toska po rodine" is so popular and well entrenched in the Russian language precisely because of its pleonastic quality, which is to say that when you choose to use the term rodina, you are already implying that you can suffer for your rodina, you are suffering for your rodina, and that you can or that you are capable of or already are suffering Toska for it. No? I also think, however, that the term rodina was full of Toska even before the Napoleonic era, and specifically towards the end of the 18th century. And I'd like to talk about that now for a little bit. Well, there's a more basic reason that the rodina should be associated with loss. And this is simply because people grow up and you have to leave your rodina behind. This can be a common experience in moving from childhood to adulthood, and one in Russia that was also related to class, because it's a fairly typical pattern among the Russian nobility to spend your in this period at least, to spend your early childhood in the country and then move at the age of 6 or 7 or 10 to a provincial city or to one of the capitals for further schooling. So for the Russian elite, the countryside is associated with the childhood, the bygone childhood, with the past, with early family relationships, and with loved ones that have been left behind. This is an established pattern in elite biographies. But since rodina in the 18th century is not yet a word that the elite can use to talk about their own feelings, when writers describe their sentimental attachment to home, when they move to Petersburg and write letters or write memoirs about how they felt about the people left behind, they are more likely to direct their sentiments towards specific persons rather than Toska, some kind of geographical space. То есть они тоскуют по специфическим лицам, но еще не по родине. Отечество, of course, is something quite different, because noblemen left their home, their native homes, what we're not yet going to call rodina, but they leave those in order to go into state service, to become educated, to go on, to go elsewhere, and that elsewhere is where Отечество is. Отечество, in a sense, is the opposite of rodina. Civic duty occurs far away from the family's country home. If the pattern of growing up and leaving home is common to the Russian elite, it seems that most peasants would have preferred to stay at home forever. This is at least true of popular ideas of the peasant, as we can see in Gagarin's verse. Peasants sometimes did have to leave home, as Gagarin's verse also reminds us. And here, of course, the situation is quite bleak, because when Russian peasants went into the military, which is one of the primary reasons that they left home, they had to serve 25-year terms of service. So there were many laments, I'm sure, produced by peasant culture itself in this period, and Gagarin is probably imitating some of those. Gagarin's example shows us then an elite writer's romantic or idyllic vision of the peasantry, and more importantly, of the peasant's strong attachment to provincial territory, a legendary propensity to Toska po rodine, in other words, characterizes the Russian peasant already before the Napoleonic Wars, and this is firmly connected to the nobleman's idea of him. This was also part of a more general historical and cultural process by which the Russian elite forged or constructed its own enduring connection with the rural territories of its childhood, These were territories filled with peasants, places where the nobleman's life overlapped with the rural peasant life. Meanwhile, the touching image of the peasant soldier, stationed far away from his rodine, was a well-worn stereotype that we also find in both Van Biesen and Karamzin, and it's not a specifically Russian idea at all. In fact, the idea of a nostalgic peasant soldier stationed far away, far from the rodine, is an idea that was common throughout Europe, and it comes up repeatedly in the dissertation of Johannes Hofer, the medical student from Basel, if you will recall, who was a leading expert in Toska по родине, or mal du pays, and responsible for coining the term nostalgia. So let's go to Switzerland for a moment. As I mentioned, Hofer first proposed the term nostalgia in 1688 in a dissertation on the subject. In this dissertation, he challenges a series of stereotypes that were already widely held at the end of the 17th century, so 100 years before the period that I'm talking about, at least. It is not true, Hofer writes, thereby letting us know what people thought was true. It is not true that only peasant soldiers suffer from nostalgia. Nor is it true that nostalgia particularly affects the Swiss. Nor is it true that it only strikes Swiss peasant soldiers. Nostalgia, he says, nostalgia is not endemic only to the territory of Switzerland, for I believe, he writes, that there are sick persons of this type among the other European peoples as well. Nostalgia is not suffered only by the captains of Swiss troops who are stationed abroad in France, but also by even young people of good families, meaning not just peasants, but also members of the elite, who, when sent abroad, cannot adapt to foreign lifestyles and cannot forget their mother's milk. He then wonders why it is, nonetheless, that the children of Switzerland do more often fall prey to nostalgia. Not only the Swiss, but more often the Swiss. Perhaps this depends on their skipping breakfast during their travels, or from the lack of good and genuine milk, which someone who is used to drinking cannot simply stop from drinking. In short, Hofer argues that homesickness is an experience that both elite and peasants share, and that the shared experience of an attachment to home is consolidated through milk, liquefied through milk. The theme of milk and mother's milk recurs several times in his dissertation. It was clearly on his mind as he argued for the pathological relevance of nostalgia. And strange as it may sound, later physicians and psychologists confirmed the link between Swiss nostalgia and dairy products. Indeed, much of the commentary on the subject produced in the next century and a half, including that by such illustrious figures such as Rousseau, Haller, and Kant, either confirm or challenge the stereotype that homesickness is innate to Switzerland and linked to Swiss peasant soldiers and to the fresh milk of the rural village. These stereotypes were familiar in Russia too, and they overlapped with the experience of the Russian elite. Village breast milk was also fundamental for the Russian nobleman's biography, and it was on the country estate of childhood that he nursed, together with a Russian peasant, and often at the breast of a Russian peasant woman. In the 18th century in Russia, there were lively discussions among the elite about whether or not one should nurse one's own children. But this remained an unusual practice. In general, peasant wet nurses were employed to feed elite children. And Denis van Biesen, for example, is undoubtedly referring to a peasant breast when he describes the agony of being weaned in his memoirs. Не знаю, для чего отнимали меня от кормилицы уже поздно. На 3-м году случилось со мною сие лишение, которое, как сказывал мне сам отец мой, переносил я с ужасным нетерпением и тоскою. Von Wiesen thus suffered weaning from breast milk as strongly as any Swiss peasant soldier. For all of his interest in Toska, Von Wiesen never uses the phrase Toska po rodine. Again, rodina was not yet available for the nobleman's self-description. Von Wiesen is the product, moreover, of an earlier era, and he prefers the term Отечество, which occurs in his Собрание сочинения 180 times, while rodina shows up only 3. That said, Von Wiesen does seem to have been extremely interested in milk. There are many tender examples of animals generously providing milk to humans in the fables that he enjoyed translating. And in one of his stories, the country home of a noble family is robbed by bandits, and the parents are brutally murdered, but a heroic peasant wet nurse carries the young infant to safety. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about the milky connections between childhood, rodina, and Switzerland in the work of Karamzin. In Pismo Русского путешественника, which was published in installments from 1791 to 1801, Karamzin clearly associates the word rodina with Switzerland. Switzerland is also the home of patriotism. This is another widespread European stereotype about Switzerland that Karamzin agrees with. And in Pismo Русского путешественника, Karamzin overhears in the city of Zurich the song of a patriotic youth, he uses the word юноша, who articulates perfectly what Karamzin believes patriotism should be, and he shares this with us. These are the words, the first bit here are the words of the youth who's singing a song. Отечество мое, любовью к тебе горит вся кровь моя, для пользы твоей я готов ее пролить, умру твоим незнешним сыном. The song goes on for a number of verses. It repeats Отечество мое several times and then closes with this somewhat curious line. На что нам блеск искусства, когда природа здесь сияет во всей своей красе, когда мы из грудей ее пьем блаженство и восторг. So, although he's singing about the love for his fatherland, repeated as I said many times, and not the motherland, the strong attachment to the homeland nonetheless allows the youth to bring up the concept of breastfeeding before the song's over. Allows Karamzin to bring up the theme of breastfeeding. Karamzin may well have been the first to argue that elite Russians could and should feel love not only for the Отечество, but also for the Rodina. He wrote an essay called Любовь к Отечеству in 1802, in which he argues that patriotism has 3 different stages. The first stage is физический, я думаю, что это физический патриотизм. This is a sense of attachment to the place where one was born, and this is something that all of mankind shares. Peasants, nobles, everyone is attached to the place they were born. Then there's a second stage of patriotism. A more select group of persons will go on to stage 2. This is moral patriotism, which is equally natural, but it's a more elevated love. It's a love that you feel for persons who come from the same region or from the same state. And only a very few Karamzin believes will go on to the third and final phase, the highest phase of patriotism, which is political patriotism. This is expressed in the love for the welfare and glory of the Отечество. This is what we see in examples from Greece and from Rome. Karamzin's ranking of 3 levels of patriotism clearly suggests that concern for the Отечество is a problem for those of higher birth, and that the road that goes from the rural childhood home where elite and peasants mingle to state service in the capital, which is a road that Karamzin himself took, was reserved for the upward moving progress of the elite. Let's look for a moment I am getting near the end. I'm going to talk a little bit more about Karamzin and then I'll move to the conclusions, okay? I want to look for a moment though at the language that Karamzin uses in describing the first stage of physical patriotism, which is the closest that he comes to speaking about rodina. And again, he's talking about a sentence. He doesn't exactly use the word rodina, but he's, oh yes, he does use the word rodina, and he's talking about a sentiment that is appropriate. He's sort of justifying that it's okay for members of the elite to feel an attachment to something that he wants to call rodina. Человек любит место своего рождения и воспитания. Сия привязанность есть общая для всех людей и народов, есть дело природы и должна быть названа физической. Родина мила сердцу, пленительными воспоминаниями, окружающими, так сказать, утро и колыбель человечества. He also addresses in the same essay the concept of Toska по родине, not using exactly that phrase, but we see it here. Самое расположение нерв привязывает нас к родине. Недаром медики советуют иногда больным лечиться ее воздухом. Недаром житель Гельветия, Switzerland, удаленный от снежных гор своих, сохнет и впадает в меланхолию, а возвращаясь в дикий Унтервальден, в суровый Гларис, оживает. Karamzin doesn't explicitly mention breasts in his essay on Любовь к Отечеству, but he does speak of mankind's cradle, of one's place of birth, of life, жизнь оживает, and of nature. It's actually interesting to see how far Karamzin can go in describing what is essentially here love, любовь к родине, without speaking of mothers. Erasure of the feminine element was rather typical in his work. Female characters are often silenced by Karamzin, and their biological prerogatives, such as giving birth or breastfeeding, are exercised by men, or by poetic muses, or as in this example, and the last one, by nature. Was nature here? Yeah, дело природы. These substitutes, it's with these substitutes, nature, the muse, and not with women, that the male writer in Karamzin has an intense emotional relationship. Karamzin speaks explicitly of breasts in Ritsar нашего времени, which is an unfinished story from 1803, a year later. This was supposedly based on his own biography. In this story, Karamzin reports that his hero was breastfed by his own mother. As I said, there was a debate about whether or not elite women should breastfeed their children, and Karamzin suggesting that yes, indeed they should. Тогда не говорил еще Руссо, но говорила уже природа, и мать героя нашего сама была его кормилицей. He then points out the advantages of breastfeeding. Perhaps he's a little bit on the defensive side, but these are fairly progressive ideas, and he needed to defend them, obviously. Our hero, he points out, is rarely sick, because на заре жизни своей плакал, кричал и не мог, реже других младенцев. This is because молоко нежных родительниц есть для детей и лучшая пища, и лучшее лекарство. Whether Karamzin was actually nursed by his mother, as this text suggests, or by a peasant wet nurse, or by a combination of these is unknown, but he prefers the literary image of the noblewoman's breast to that of the peasant. So what we have here is ostensibly a discussion of nourishment, how to take care of children, healthy habits, but the implicit subtext here is one of real Toska, because Karamzin lost his mother when he was only 3 years old. So what we have here is a year after he writes a treatise on patriotism, an essay in which he avoids mentioning breastfeeding, Then he begins an autobiographical story in which he addresses breastfeeding quite directly, but he doesn't finish that story. And in fact, at this point, Karamzin not only breaks off his fictionalized autobiography, but he stops writing literature altogether and moves on to the larger and less intimate problems of Russian history. So let's try to draw some, we've gotten rather far away from where we started. Let's try to draw some conclusions, okay? So today we've spoken about the Russian elite in the early 19th century, and how they arrived at an idea of rodina that is specifically associated to sentiments of both attachment and loss. One historical catalyst for the evolution of rodina's status in elite literary texts was the experience of the French invasion, but ideas of rodina developed along a different path as well, that of the Russian nobleman's own biography, a path that figuratively also takes us through Switzerland, from which Russians drew literary ideas of mother's milk, peasant villages, and bountiful nature, together with notions of extreme patriotism. But love for the rodina, or what Karamzin calls physical patriotism, is not only Swiss, and neither is Toska for the rodina, Toska po rodině. As we know, the mother's breast must be left behind. But for many elite Russians in the 18th and early 19th centuries, growing up meant not only leaving childhood, but also leaving the rural countryside and the breast of a peasant wet nurse. Later on in the 19th century, many elite Russians grew convinced that the cultural origins of Russia, and even Russianness itself, could be found among the customs of the peasants, the peasant narod. Their enthusiasm for the narod was encouraged both by the Napoleonic conflict and by Romanticism in general, but also by their own personal experiences. An idealized image of the peasant also derived from Rousseau, of course, whose ideas on men and nature explicitly influenced both Van Wiesen and Karamzin, both of whom were happy to apply the lessons of Rousseau to the description of their own experiences, as each illustrates by focusing on the theme of nursing in retelling his own childhood. The language that we found in Gagarin's poem Toska po rodině was initially used by elite Russian writers in order to depict peasants in the countryside, both Swiss peasants and Russian peasants, but Russian writers later came to apply Swiss ideals to characterizations of themselves and to characterizations of their own relationship to their native land. In literary texts from the 18th century, Russians associate the concepts of Отечество and Rodina with different sentiments. Attachment to the Отечество tends to be performed as love, or любовь к Отечеству, while the Rodina is more easily associated with Toska. Отечество makes us think of любовь к Отечеству and patriotism. Rodina is Toska. As I noted earlier, the very idea of Rodina seems to contain within it a sense of loss, a sense of Toska for something that is already missing. Perhaps the actual losses caused by the Napoleonic Wars encouraged this connection in different ways. Certainly, Russians did regret the destruction of their homeland, so it's easier to speak of Toska po rodině after you've watched Napoleon's troops destroy your Rodina. But it also seems to me that this destruction encouraged them to express or to give voice to a more general and deep-rooted sense of loss that they felt towards their childhood homes long before Napoleon ever showed up. This was a Swiss theme, as we've mentioned. It was also a universal human theme, but it was a very important theme for the Russian nobility. Thank you. Это конец.
Good, thanks. Спасибо. Так, срезюмировать или как? Да, нет, нет, да, нет. Не надо? Нет, она все прекрасно поняли, да? Хорошо, тогда не будем резюмировать. Спасибо большое, Сара, было очень интересно. Как всегда, пожалуйста.
Oh, I have another picture.
Oh,
Let's
okay, just breasts.
Just more breasts.
Okay, let's add them all. Пожалуйста, уважаемые коллеги, дорогие студенты, пожалуйста, вопросы, комментарии, может быть, что-нибудь было, не знаю, нуждается в пополнении, в выяснении, пожалуйста, слушаем вас, слушаем вопросы. Напоминаю студентам, конечно, не коллегам, глупые вопросы не бывает. Такие все вопросы, конечно, интересные, все вопросы умны. У меня куча очень наивных, но я уверен, не глупых вопросов. Okay? Даша, пожалуйста.
I was going to say, if you have questions, maybe you should go on with yours.
Как скажете, хорошо.
Or I can ask you a question.
Давай.
It's not really a question. It's more of I hope not very stupid remark. Thank you very much for this talk. It was very interesting, and especially I was interested by the part where you talked about the concept of Toska applied to peasants in elite writings. So the image of the Russian people and the way that народ was represented as тоскующий по родине in poetry, as you cited the poet of 1795, and I believe later as well. And it got me thinking because
and earlier as well.
And earlier, of course, yes. And it got me thinking because this idea, this theme of representing the people and talking about the peasant, or from the point of view of the peasant by through stereotypes or through constructing this peasant voice from the point of view of the elite, Toska seems to be one of the elements, as you pointed out, constitutive of this discourse. And because what got me thinking is in the peasant poetry in the 19th century and also in the 20th century, in the beginning of the 20th century, the word Toska, I will have to check, but I would like to check to see how much was it used by Koltsov, by Nikitin, by Drozhin, by Surikov, and then of course Yesenin, Kluyev, especially in Yesenin's work, Toska is almost in every poem. In Kluyev also, I just checked a little bit, it's also there. But there is also the peasant version, Горе гореваница, Доля, Кручина, and for example in one of Kluyev's poems in 1932, so in later years, there's a poem that puts in parallel three emotions, three sad emotions: тосковать, печалиться, кручиниться. And it is especially, this is why I'm talking about it, because it is a poem in which various references, various cultural references come together. The ones from antiquity, because так не кручинилась Хлоя, so it's Chloe from Daphnis and Chloe, and also references from, let's say, a Russian context, a popular Russian context.
So which poem? Who's poem? This is
Kluyev, Nikolai Kluyev, yes. And so,
I'd like to see that. That sounds interesting.
yeah, and so this is a poem that he directs towards his lover, Anatoly Yerkavchenko, and the lyrical subject says, the way I'm longing for you, it is not comparable to the way that так не тоскует мать о сыне, так не печалится незакатный свет, и так не кручинилась Хлоя, и тысячи влюбленных душ, etc. So, you see, and I believe this is linked to what you said, and this is the general context in which this poem also could be read.
That's really interesting, because there's, like I said, there's the first Toska seems to appear, this elevated Toska, no? Is a classical subject, so you find it in Greek things, French, imitations of French, imitations of Greek things. Then you find it in tragic drama, which maybe is Slavic, maybe it takes place in Kiev or something, but it's supposed to sound Greek. It's all very, and then there are these eclogues, or still Greek, but they're Greek peasants.
Yes.
They're Greek peasants, and they're playing on the harp, and they're, cavorting around in olive groves and so on, and they're talking about Toska. And then it becomes something at some point, and I'm not exactly sure when. I mean, you see it in Gagarin, and I found earlier examples that talk about Toska being felt by the peasant who's going to military service. That seems to be the first Toska, something dramatic, leaving the homeland to go to military service. So there are different levels of it, but they seem to, the peasantness of it, there's a classical peasant who suffers Toska, and then there's a Russian peasant who suffers Toska, and it's interesting how they blend together or don't blend together, but it sounds that Rudolphe is playing with the two levels.
He does, and he also plays not only in this poem, of course, but from the beginning, he plays with the all the words and concepts that are linked either to the elite representation of the peasantry in literature, of course, and the peasant voice, as much as there is a peasant voice in literature. And so he plays with these concepts and representations. And I believe Toska is one of them.
I wonder if, to what extent Rudolphe and Yesenin are both performing Toska because they're performing peasantness. And to be a peasant, I'm a peasant writer, you need to talk about Toska a lot.
I think this is completely true. For the most part, of course, it is completely true. But then in Yesenin there's also something very, very interesting, the way that his peasant Toska morphs into the urban Toska. So what happens with Moskva Kabatskaya, for example, after 1918, and this becomes in the 20th century, this is one of the roots of this general feeling of Russian Toska also.
Have you read this article by Sheila Fitzpatrick about Toska?
No, I
haven't. It's really
just
interesting. She talks a lot about memoirs, I think of it. The memoir texts of normal, average Soviet citizens, not literary figures. And she's just surprised that they're supposed to be talking about how patriotic and happy they are all the time, instead they're talking about Toska all the time. And they might be peasants or from peasant families. I don't remember exactly,
but I think Yesenin's, and after that I will not speak anymore, Yesenin's Toska is, I think maybe, but you have to correct me if I'm wrong, we can draw a line from Yesenin's Toska and the way he constructs it, of course, in his poetry, up to Shukshyn, Kalina, Rябина Krasnaya, and this feeling of sadness in front of the vast lands, as you.
Because that's what Epstein's basically saying. I mean, Epstein is basing what he says about Russianness, and Toska is somehow in the Russian landscape, and so if you're Russian and you're in that landscape, it's in your soul. But he's basing that on association of the peasant.
Yes.
The Russian landscape is full of peasants, and those peasants are feeling Toska, according to somebody, and that's why the Russian landscape is full of Toska. And I'm trying to figure out where it might come from peasant songs that then are associated with the peasantry, but I think it's the idea that Russia is full of Toska, I think is an elite idea, and they're using the peasants to illustrate that.
Yes.
And then the peasants adopt that idea and say, okay, тоскуем все время.
And,
It's true.
and drinking also all the time.
Yes,
I think you,
maybe that's where the Toska.
I think Yesenian might be one of the crucial sources for this, and the way, of course, he was read and the reception of Yesenian. Because there is also, as you said, Toska по родине, the land that you lost, the land that is not accessible anymore. And Yesenian's, all of Yesenian's also atmosphere, well, not all of it, but most of Yesenian, it draws on the sentiment of this Russia that we are losing or that we lost. So, this peasant Russia. So, I think.
Thank you. Пожалуйста, еще вопросы, комментарии. Luba.
Personally, I'm always a little embarrassed with the idea of Russianness and the idea of soul of peoples. And my question is, does this idea that peoples have a soul and in the same time the idea of that Toska is specifically Russian appear at the same time? For example, at the same time that Herder's Volksgeist, do you see a link between this?
What time are you?
1770s?
I don't think so. I tried to figure out when. I mean, there's a kind of a notion of personal Toska in reports of 1812. Like I feel Toska. I saw my family home destroyed. The idea of Toska as being a characteristic of Russia, I agree. Russianness, it's a creepy word, and please put it in quotation marks. Some people are thinking about Russianness when they're doing this, and they think that Toska is. I don't agree with Epstein. But it's a very romantic view of things. So where does this idea come from? That we're Russian, so we're Toskuyim. A lot of people that talk about Russian, Toska being specifically Russian, mention Gogol, which is a strange connection because Gogol, as we know, is Ukrainian, right? And so what's he writing about exactly, and where is the Toska? In Mертвые души, which is supposed to be about Toska, I think the word Toska occurs one time. I did a search on that one. So it's not, I mean, searching for the word Toska is a kind of limiting thing. I mean, if you're going to use different words that express grief or sadness, there are many words.
In Gogol, there's the sense of loss of the space associated with the childhood, which is precisely the Ukraine, with happy memories. And I mean, his first words are very much about how this world is disappearing. And especially, I mean, he especially feels, one of the reasons he feels so estranged, or his characters feel so estranged to the capital, is that because it is so far away, culturally and emotionally, from that idealized space of childhood, of lost childhood. So it's probably there. But it's interesting again, as you said, because, I mean, the guy was not Russian.
So Epstein says, this you find this in Gogol, you find this in Pushkin, you find this in Yesenin, and so therefore it is fact.
So the interesting...
But I don't think Gogol thought that he was speaking of something specifically Russian or Ukrainian. He was speaking of his own personal experience, probably. And then at some point, somebody decides that this has to be written in capital letters and it's something Russian. and I'm not sure exactly when that is. It's not, I don't think that sense of, I think it's after Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, because I've looked a little bit in their works for some kind of sense of Toska. They don't really use the word very much. They're not interested in it. It might have to do with the romanticization of the peasant in this period that we're talking about, the, you know, the 1920s or in the 19
Because I don't know what you think about the book of Svetlana Boym on nostalgia, but her idea is that this Russianness of Toska appears in at the same time that the nation state, more or less the same time.
I'll have to look at that again.
Yep.
I mean, I think the idea of Toska in the literary text appears basically in, you know, the early 1700s, but just a word here and there. It's not a very. It gets going in the 1750s, but it's not a. I don't think it's a Russian sentiment at all. It's a sentiment that.
But not the Russians, but the national color of anguish and of notions like anguish, anxiety appears in this time where people try to construct their identity, their national identity.
No, exactly. I mean, if I can jump in here, what seems really striking to me is that we talked about Gogol, right, who's supposedly a Russian writer and who is someone who comes from the Ukraine. For so long he was presented, the Ukraine was presented as sort of a cultural variation of Russia and of some kind of region. And what is interesting is that local identities are not, I'm not talking about the 20th century, I'm not even talking about the late 19th century, but for a very long time local identities were not something that were used by Russian writers. You know, they were, and it is true that the modern Russian literature was built in a parallel effort to nation building in the sense of building the Russian Empire. And as we know, you know, the literature of classicism was built and developed as the empire, and in large part in order to serve this political project. And I mean, it always, what is interesting is that one of the first writers who actually, when you're a student of Russian literature and you read something, you read a history of Russian literature, it seems like they all come from Moscow or Petersburg, right? When you start digging, it appears that, as you said, I mean, they were born in different areas and then leave to go to the main cities. And one of the first writers who actually talks about this is precisely Karate, who has this distinctive feeling of attachment to his local homeland of Simbirsk. And I had a question when I was listening to you. You told us about Rodina. What about the term Malaya Rodina? When did that appear, right? And when did that appear? Any idea?
It might be in Daria. Actually, maybe not the phrase Malaya Rodina, but I think in the definition of Rodina and Dog, he says, you know, Rodina could be A, something small, B, something slightly bigger. And he describes what then Malaya Rodina. And
Malaya Rodina, to a French here like mine, I mean, it does sound like a borrowing from the French language, right? Petite patrie, probably. I mean, I don't know, but we have the same, and it might be this direction, not in the other one, as often happens.
When is it used in French, do you know?
That's a good question. I would have to look into that. And I was wondering, you talked about when rodina started being used, and what about Отечество? Because you're right. I mean, in 18th century literature, they're obsessed with Отечество, which is a lot to do with what we just said, that literature is very sort of politically oriented, right?
Mhm.
And then patriotically
Mhm.
oriented.
And not regional. Отечество is not regional.
Yeah, and does that appear a lot in Отечество, in like Soviet patriotic discourse, or not? I mean, I remember the poster, right? Specifically this term, right?
Discourse.
This
In the official
term,
discourse.
именно этот термин, да? Отечество.
No, it's
Отечество.
just
Отечественная война,
война.
Отечественная война, действительно. Yeah, indeed. And but in the adjective, what about the substantive? It is used as well, right? Okay. And because this Родина зовет, of course, right? Which is used in the patriotic posters precisely at a moment of loss. Right, at a moment of loss when the country is being invaded again. Before the Великая Отечественная война, any use of this image of Rodina in the 20s, the 30s? Yes, no.
Don't know. Just after the revolution, this discourse wasn't very wasn't used by in the official sphere because it wasn't more nationalities.
They talk about страна, right? Страна Советов, там такое есть.
Пролетариат и так далее. То есть само понятие Родина возвращается в 20 году в связи с польско-русской войной.
С войной.
С войной. То есть тут нужно мобилизовать население, и которое как-то не откликается на призыв поддержать, сражаться за пролетарство, за пролетариат. And after this, the notion of Rodina and Отечество, both of these words, come back very strongly in the 30s.
In the 30s, okay.
Yeah, of course. But also, if I may add, I don't know if you have it right after 1917, but I believe you have it very strongly at the end of the perestroika and in the 90s.
In the 70s too.
Yeah, yes.
But I remember my class book about у нас есть дорогие слова. Это мама, папа, and the text finished with the sentence но самое дорогое слово это Родина. No, before the words like mother, father, we have Rodina with
But this is the late stagnation period. This is
this is end of the 60s. No, I was very.
I was thinking of something else actually. I was thinking of the phrase "за царя и отечество" for the Tsar and the country, and this is of course a phrase. I don't know, it's not of course, but to me it's a phrase coined by literature and cinema in movies, in historical dramas that choose as a subject the war against Napoleon or
Mhm.
or yeah, or the Decembrists. Or
You think
something else.
it's a fake phrase, an invented phrase for a
I don't know, but what I know is that when the craze for old-time Russia began at the end of the perestroika and in the beginning of the 90s, excuse me, you have, if you read, the journals, Novy Mir, Zvezda, etc., you have a lot of articles that depict, that depict this pre-revolutionary Russia as the golden age. And so Отечество, I believe, also, gains in that perspective.
Mhm.
But within the phrase Царя Отечества, and also you have, in the popular culture, in mass culture, you have this, the song Господа офицеры, for example, and you have also to die for your Отечество.
Mhm.
And the movies like Сибирский цирюльник, or you have the protagonist that sits in front of this vast land and everything, or Kornilov, more recent one. This is all the Russia that we've lost. So
Mhm.
the Russianness equals nostalgia, equals
Mhm.
some kind of, and maybe this is why also when you have movies that depict this old Russia not in the same way or not exactly in the same way, there's scandal, like with Matilda.
Mhm.
Riva.
Basing on my pure linguistic intuition, I would like to embrace your thesis about the connection between Отечество more with 19th century and Rodina more with 20th century. It's easy to check it. If some of you who have your PCs, you can just go to Национальный корпус русского языка and see the chronology. It's very easy. But before doing this, already what Daria was saying about За царя за Отечество, I think we can remember right now the counterpart in the Soviet times, За родину за Сталина.
Of course, this
So
is
it's very nice that we have За царя за Отечество and За родину за Сталина. This is just to bring something to prove your thesis, but as I've said before, it's very easy to check it. The other remark that I wanted to make is that what you were saying about the connection between Rodina and breastfeeding could be a very good comment to the poetry of Khodasevich that I think lots of us remembered when we were listening to what you were talking about. Внимательно русскую крестьянкой Еленой Кузиной я выклала. Do you know this? Okay, I permit myself to cite some lines from this because it really embraces very well what you were talking about. Внимательно прусскую крестьянкой Еленой Кузиной я выкормлен. And then he goes further, and at the end he says, и вот Россия, громкая держава, ее сосцы губями теребя, я высосал мучительное право тебя любить и проклинать тебя. So hope this can serve you.
Yeah, it will.
You can
That's
use it.
great.
Еще, пожалуйста, вопрос с комментарием. Нет, у меня пара вопросов, маленькие очень вопросики. Ты сказал, что начиная там с времен Ломоносова слово встречается в высоких жанрах. Если я правильно понял, я записал, что слово «тоска» встречается в эпосе. Это мне показалось немножко странным, или я наоборот не понял, потому что я лично склонен это ассоциировать как раз вот с жанрами вроде элегии, которые входят, скорее всего, в категорию малых жанров. Я не очень понимаю, как можно использовать такое понятие в эпосе, например. Это первый вопрос. И второй вопрос. я всегда думал, но может быть по чистому невежеству, что ностальгия имеет отношение к времени, да, что это тоска по прошлому. А тут, значит, поэтому получается, что вот в случае, если я правильно, значит, если я не ошибаюсь,
а не раньше.
я думаю, что, а кто помнит этимологию слова ностальгия?
Nostos alge sofrent.
Это не типа
Это придуманное слово, кажется, это придумал вот этот врач.
Нет, это я понял, но он придумал на основе греческих корней, правильно, да?
Да.
И я всегда думал, что это типа там, что это
Я думаю, что...
взгляд брошенный назад или что-нибудь.
Нет, это
Нет?
что-то возвращение может быть.
No.
Боль для возвращения, не знаю, не помню.
Ну, короче, метафора, она временная, да, а вот тоска по родине, метафора, она скорее всепространственная, да, то есть как можно...
No.
I just googled the etymology of nostalgia. Nostos — возвращение, поездка. Algus.
Поездка. Значит...
In this essay, Hofer, when he writes about, in his dissertation, when he's inventing the word and explaining it, he says this word is what is, in German they call it Heimweh, in French it's mal du pays, and we're going to call it nostalgia. And he talks about soldiers who are not, they can't be soldiers because they're in the army somewhere else. But not just them, but mostly them. And you can see that already in 1688, mal du pays or Heimweh are things that, these are things that soldiers, peasant soldiers suffer from. Everybody knows what it is. It's when you are sent off somewhere and you can't go home and you cry yourself to sleep every night, or so, you know, we know what that is, right? And that's nostalgia. But then he said this is an illness and it needs to, you cure people, and it was an illness. It was a very important illness during the Napoleonic Wars. Many medical treatises were written on it, and then in the late 1900s, or late 1800s, early 1900s, it's suddenly not a disease anymore. Medicine, they change their ideas from time to time.
Okay, and anything in Myatlif related to toska po rodine, or and in connection with food, for instance, or not? Don't remember.
On the epic, у меня есть один пример, и может быть есть только один пример, не знаю, не помню сейчас, но это Петр Великий Ломоносова, где он пишет о народе, который жил раньше, до Петра. И как они жили? Они жили в отчаянии, в тоске и в стенании без сна. It's a little weird and maybe awkward, and maybe that kind of toska that refers to the sufferings of the Russian people as a group is not very successful. I don't think I found many other examples of it, but it is a serious genre, and he's using the word toska in a serious context.
And toska, does it have a Old Slavonic? Is it an Old Slavonic word or not? The etymology of toska? Well, I
Let's go
think you
back to the
showed that.
song.
Because I mean, that could explain why it is used in the high genre of the ode by Lomonosov, and why it was not used by Jurgenson, right? Yeah.
It exists, but I don't know which text it can be found.
Okay. Okay.
Because what I did in my search basically was look at, the classic authors of the 18th century, and like I said, if you start with Prokofiev, it's not there. And other texts, to find it in other texts, I need to have them online, basically,
Right.
unless you just happen to be reading who knows what. But I looked through all of, everything I could find written by Prokopowicz online, and could find no Tosk. So I don't know, it exists in Old Russian, but maybe in some, you might have an Old Russian dictionary that would actually give me some sites and texts, but I'll give you examples of where one might be found.
Fassmer is not very sure of the etymology, but he relies Toska with a stusnouti in the Old Slavonic. So and he gives the Greek parallel that is aganaktein. Like, I'm not that good in Greek, but I guess that we can start from there to find out. What was it? I guess that it could be that Toska тесный стеснение could be actually related. It could be the same root, but from the Fassmer's text, it's not that
Obvious.
evident.
Okay.
Well, Sinichkina thought it was related, I guess, to Skanuti.
Yep. And could you go back to the image from the edition of Khvastova's отрывки? So she's grieving, right? Она тоскует.
In
Наверно.
this text, this is two, well, I don't know, there are two stories in this volume, but the first one is about the clock has now struck midnight. That one looks more like about 12:30. The clock has now struck midnight and she's very alone, and she's alone because her friends have somehow turned on her and abandoned her. Society is not being good to her, but she doesn't explain why.
Okay.
And then she says, my heart now flies to Kiev and to the cave monastery where I find solace. My heart now flies to the lonely shores of Finland. Maybe there's a third example. And then she tells these little vignettes about, oh, my heart now flies to the embrace of my dear father. Is this the one where she describes leaving her father at some point, as if she had gotten married and had to leave her rodine? But it's vague, she doesn't really say, it's poetic prose basically,
Right.
she's not
Okay.
specifying.
It's just that there's another connection between patriotism and Toska, which is loyalty, right? And the dog is an embodiment of loyalty, I think, in iconology, isn't it? So she is a dog. You know, on tombs, when sculpted dogs are represented, they embody loyalty. So it's another connection, because in order to be patriotic, you have to be loyal to your rodine.
What is the woman with the anchor?
I don't know about the anchor. You should check out in an iconology.
I've been looking.
Anchor normally is hope, no? And I would add that this posture is is typical iconography for melancholy. All the romantic poets, like Byron and Baratynsky in Russia, all of them have this same pose.
Okay. Any more questions or comments? No? Нет? Студенты? От студентов? Ничего? Ничего нет от студентов? Какого нового молодежного слова? Пока? Нет? Окей. Спасибо большое, Сара.
Спасибо.